Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Naguib Mahfouz's novel, Midaq Alley. Now, Mahfouz is one of the most important Egyptian novelists and one of the most important novelists of the Arab world. He is, in fact, I think, the first Arab writer to win a Nobel Prize for Literature. So Mahfouz is a big deal. Midaq Alley is an interesting novel in that it's one of those novels that's really driven by place much more than it is by conflict. So there's a plot, but it's not necessarily the most interesting thing about the novel. And when I say there's a plot, really there's a series of short conflicts with some overarching conflicts drawn out through them. And what unites these conflicts for the most part is that they're all set in this alley. And to a certain extent, they all have the same thematic concerns, largely with love and money. Mahfouz really emphasizes this idea that Midaq Alley does not change, that it is a stable, stationary thing. So the very beginning of the novel, the first 2 paragraphs I want to read you. Many things combine to show that Midaq Alley is one of the gems of times gone by, and that it once shone forth like a flashing star in the history of Cairo. Which Cairo do I mean? That of the Fatimids, the Mamluks, or the Sultans? Only God and the archaeologists know the answer to that, but in any case the alley is certainly an ancient relic, and a precious one. How could it be otherwise, with its stone-paved surface leading directly to the historic Sandanika Street? And then there is its cafe known as Kirsha's. Its walls, decorated with multicolored arabesques, now crumbling, give off strong odors from the medicines of olden times, smells which have now become the spices and folk cures of today and tomorrow. Although Midaq Alley lives in almost complete isolation from all surrounding activity, it clamors with a distinctive and personal life of its own. Fundamentally and basically, its roots connect with life as a whole, and yet, at the same time, it retains a number of the secrets of a world now past. And actually, whoever owned this copy of the book before me wrote Timeless Alley in the top margin. But we also get this idea reinforced almost at the very end of the novel. In the last chapter, which gives us a sort of denouement, we go back to this idea of Midaq Alley as timeless, or somehow standing outside of time. In the 3rd paragraph of the last chapter, Mahfouz writes, "This was the normal pattern of life in the alley, disturbed only occasionally when one of its girls disappeared or one of its menfolk was swallowed by the prison. But soon such bubbles subsided into its lake-like surface, calm or stagnant, and by evening whatever might have happened in the morning was almost forgotten." So that's essentially what happens in the novel, is we have life in this alley that's interrupted or disturbed briefly by a few incidents, and then life goes on. So we got a lot of different characters here, and I'm not going to talk through all of them, but if I were going to say that there's a protagonist of this novel, it would probably be Hamida, who is the beautiful girl of the alley that a lot of people want to marry, or at least sleep with. We get a lot of her feelings, a lot of her sort of internal world, in a way that we don't get with a lot of the other characters. Hamida is interested in money, clothes, makeup, material comfort. Those are the things that primarily drive her. And so when she seeks out a husband, the first person she agrees to marry is a barber named Abbas. And she agrees to marry him because he's convinced by his friend to... It's kind of important to know that this is set during World War II. That'll come up, and I'm going to talk more about that. But Abbas is convinced by his friend to go work for the British military, because that's where all the money is to be made. And so once Hamida learns that Abbas is going to go off and make his fortune working for the British, she agrees to marry him. Then we have a wealthy, older, he's an owner of several businesses, and he's like the richest guy in the alley, Salwan, and he decides that his own wife is not sexually satisfying enough to him, and so he proposes to marry Hamida. She and her mother agree to this, but then Salwan is struck down with a heart attack that leaves him sort of shaken and basically a shell of himself for the rest of the novel. Then Hamida meets a sort of sleek, well-dressed guy from outside the alley, and he sort of lures her away with the promise of being in love, and then basically she, at his behest, becomes a prostitute and makes a good amount of money doing that. So that's the closest we get to a protagonist, but there's also large chunks of the novel where Hamida is really not central, where the conflicts of people like Kirsha take center stage, or Uncle Camille. We've got this weird, eccentric, interesting cast of characters who get their own various spotlight. And so again, that's the sort of central thrust of Midaq Alley, is life goes on. Things happen, but life goes on. Now, there's a few interesting things I really do want to talk about here. One is that some of the characters are extremely discontent with life in the alley. Hamida is not pleased with life in the alley, but she's less concerned about the alley as such and more concerned about being poor. But we've got Hussein Kirsha, who's the son of the cafe owner, and also Abbas's friend, who convinces him to go work for the British military. Hussein hates life in the alley. Abbas loves it. He doesn't want to leave, but to win Hamida, he does agree to. But we've got this section that I think is sort of representative of the disdain that Hussein and a couple of other characters hold for the alley. And it also introduces us to this other really important point that I find really interesting. And I'll talk about that after. It says, the barber, that's Abbas, now really perplexed, asked, "Why do you make fun of this life? Is this life at all? Everyone in the alley is half dead, and if you live here long, you won't need burying. God have mercy on you." Abbas hesitated, then asked, although he could anticipate the reply, "What do you want me to do?" "The many times I've told you," shouted Hussein, "the times I've given you my advice. Shake off this miserable life, close up your shop, leave this filthy alley behind. Rest your eyes from looking at Uncle Camille's carcass. Work for the British Army. It's a gold mine that will never be exhausted. Why, it's exactly like the treasury of Hussan al-Basari. The war isn't the disaster that fools say it is, it's a blessing. God sent it to us to rescue us from our poverty and misery. Those air raids are throwing gold down on us. I'm still telling you to join the British Army. Italy is finished, but Germany isn't defeated and Japan is behind her. The war will last at least another 20 years. I'm telling you For the last time, there are jobs to be had at Tel El Kabir. Go and get one." The barber was so excited he had difficulty in finishing his job. Abbas had a lazy dislike for change, dreaded anything new, hated traveling, and if he were left to himself, he would make no choice other than the alley. If he spent the rest of his life there, he would be quite happy. The truth was, he loved it. So here we've got this conflict of the alley as this sort of sanguine place in which things don't happen. Like, Abbas is driven by inertia, and Hussein is saying, go out and make money. So we've got that central theme of the novel, but we've also got this idea of World War II as a blessing. And we get this a couple of other times. There's some other interesting spots. Like at one point in chapter 19, there's a big political rally in which the candidate who's an Egyptian nationalist, tries to get Kirsha's support. And basically it's a sort of material bargain. It's because for whatever reason, Kirsha is politically influential in the alley. But we have this interesting bit here. Kirsha is reflecting on how he had been a political activist, or indeed a revolutionary in the anti-colonial, anti-British movement. He says he no longer hated anyone, not the Jews or the Armenians, nor even the British. He had no favorites either, and it was surprising then that at one time he felt a curious enthusiasm for the present war, in which he sided with the Germans. He often wondered about Hitler's plans and whether it was possible that the Führer might lose the war, and whether the Russians would not be wise to accept the unilateral peace offered them. Kirsha thought of Hitler as the world's greatest bully. Indeed, his admiration for him stemmed from what he heard of his cruelty and barbarity. He wished him success, viewing him like those mythical bravados of literature, Antar and Abu Sa'id. And then later we've got this section where after Hussein has lost his job with the British Army and Abbas has not yet, Hussein says, "How can the war end so quickly? Who would have believed it possible?" This is because the war is winding up. Abbas shook his head. It made no difference to him whether the war continued or ended, or whether he worked or not. He no longer cared about anything. It bored him to talk with his friend, although he found it better than sitting alone and thinking. Abbas is deeply depressed because he's gotten back from, or he's come back on vacation from working for the British Army, and learned that Hamida has been gone for like 2 months, and people are just like, yep, we've moved on. And Abbas is heartbroken because the whole thing, going to the British Army and doing this job, was meant to be for her, and she just left and was like, whatever, I don't care about you, Abbas. So he's incredibly depressed. "How can it have ended so quickly?" asked Hussein. "Everybody hoped Hitler would be able to prolong it indefinitely. It's our bad luck that's brought it to an end." "You're right." Hussein shouted furiously, What hopeless wretches we are! Our country is pitiful, and so are the people. Why is it that the only time we find a little happiness is when the world is involved in a bloody war? Surely it's only the devil who has pity on us in this world. So we've got that element of it, this complicated attitude toward the war, which is not in a way that surprising when you consider Egypt's position in World War II. So in 1922, Egypt nominally became independent of the British, but the British were still allowed to garrison troops there. The British controlled the Suez Canal, and the British could change the king or the ruling party if those entities were not favorable to British interests. So it was independence. in scare quotes, more than actual meaningful independence for Egypt. And then when World War II began, protecting the Suez Canal was a critical British interest, and so a lot of British troops were stationed in Egypt. There was still a lot of anti-British sentiment in Egypt because, again, Britain had been the colonial ruler of Egypt for quite a long time. For the better part of a century, I think. And so that, you have those tensions, like, but on the other hand, it's weird for me as a reader in 2021 to be reading a text where people are like, yeah, I support Hitler just because I want the war to go on. I don't care what the sort of external effects of that are. I mean, and I guess that makes sense. It has its own logic, but it's a weird thing to have this sort of shrug your shoulders attitude toward Nazism and the Holocaust. But at the same time, it does make sense that Egyptians would have mixed feelings about World War II and about the British. Like, on the one hand, they work for them, the characters work for the British to make money, but they're not necessarily super supportive of the British war effort as such. So it's an interesting tension in the novel. The other thing that strikes me is that the third to last chapter, chapter 33, is about this character named Radwan Husseini, who is a sort of serene, pious character whom a lot of the people in the alley go to for advice. Husseini lost his children. They died. And after that, he just sort of embraced this philosophy of joy in God's will. So he's really interesting. He's serene, etc., etc. And in chapter 33, he decides that he's going to go on the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is one of the pillars of Islam. And what we get in 33 is mostly just a really long speech by Husseini where he sort of lays out his philosophy. And given how positively this character is depicted throughout the novel, I feel like Mahfouz is giving us a moral lesson. Like, he's giving us his moral lesson that he wants us to take from this novel. And basically, Husseini's whole speech is like, you must find joy in everything. Even in your suffering, you must find joy, because all of it comes from God, and God is perfect. He couldn't make anything imperfect, and therefore everything should be a source of joy. And it's not a terrible philosophy. It's not super interesting, but it comes almost exactly at the end of the novel, and it's given a massive amount of page space. So it's just very, very important here.